For today's podcast, we're going over the First Amendment, and for this, we need to understand that the actual historical context between each of its sections of the First Amendment of the which is one of the amendments within the Bill of Rights, to actually understand its historic context, to see where what it actually means. Now, a lot of people tend to misinterpret it because they don't understand this, and that's a major fault of many people. Now, in the first part, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, when we look back with it previous to this point, is Thomas Jefferson was noted to have correspondences about this point, and people worried that there would actually be a specific establishment of a certain type of Protestant religion, because Protestant religions were the only available religions in the United States at the time. They were actually, as a majority religion, they would have been accepted in government. And because of this, there were people that were actually worried that one would be respected as the established religion, and others would be denounced as not being denounced as the being improper, not being allowed, and being essentially like a theocracy, similar to what the Church of England had, or how we see theocracies in the Middle East, or how, for the most part, how Israel's a theocracy, and how they really don't give fair treatment to both Christianity and Muslim faiths, and as well as other faiths, by consider themselves as a theocracy. And he basically made it so considering the idea that people are free to exercise their own religion, and that the idea that the government is not allowed to establish a religion. So it's not that people cannot follow no religion at all, which just by this idea, that it stated that people could follow no religion at all and be an atheist. But it said that Congress is essentially going to not make any religion their actual established religion. But it does not necessarily mean that Congress cannot use those religions to guide them in law. Their actual personal religion cannot guide them in law. That is number one, not part of it. It does not necessarily mean that we cannot have public signs of religion in the public square. These have nothing to do with it, because as you see with this, it does not state this at all, because they're not establishing a specific religion. An actual symbol does not count as actually establishment of religion. This is only referring right here in this first part, is only establishing to the state religion. And as long as they are not establishing a state religion, they're not disobeying the Constitution. So an establishment of any type of symbols in the public square would not be by the actual governments, being local, state, or federal would not be a violation thereof, regardless of what people like the Freedom from Religion Foundation would think, or any other progressive group has tried to interpret the First Amendment as. Because all it means on this first part is it just means that they cannot establish a state religion. And it was referring to what was happening in Britain with the Church of England, which is also known as the Anglican Church, which is what it's called today. And that's a major point that needs to be brought up. And this is something that is completely misinterpreted. People assume that that there cannot be any that there has to be a separation of. They assume this right here, meaning separation of church and state, but there is no such statement right there. It says separation of church and state. All it's stating right here is that the state cannot establish a state religion. That's the only thing it cannot do, and it cannot prohibit you from having your own beliefs. As long as it does not do either one of those two, it is within its boundaries to do whatever it wants to do. Now, if it is misusing funds to do this and start wasting money by actually start purchasing a lot of goods, then we can start talking on the financing end, but that's a complete and utter different issue. If it keeps using money year after year after year to buy more and more things for these purposes, but that only goes in the financing end of misallocation of funds. And someone can argue on the funding issue of wasted tax dollars, and that goes into a completely different issue. And someone could bring up that point. And it says, or abridging the freedom of speech. Now this would be when it says they cannot abridge freedom of speech. This means that basically any form of freedom of speech, any form of speech cannot be abridged. Now, the only in this with it, the only law that actually fits is that's considered a violation is when you do a call to action which becomes in the criminal code, such as basically calling people to riot, and that's because when they say yelling fire in a theater, this is basically the same idea of creating having people riot, and but when it comes to that is abridging freedom of speech. Now, when it comes down to it, they meant this to establish the public square. And the problem being nowadays is there used to be an essential public square because the way people interacted, but since we don't have that anymore, and because the way media, the way people interact with one another is a lot different, we've actually come to a little bit of a problem. This is something to where the government has had a little bit of an issue. We have groups that are essentially subsidized by the government called social media, which have now, because they're subsidized, they essentially can be labeled as quasi-government groups, being social media, and that makes a very, very tough situation on what we're calling about with on the topic of freedom of speech and abridgment. Now, there's some very, very key things on that. Now, these sources of speech and interaction with people, because people no longer tend to have the interaction for key issues and being able to have your voice heard in normal matters that were known back then, and being able to call speeches in the town square, because this just doesn't exist anymore. This hasn't existed in a long time. So ever since the idea of social media came about, the idea of calling a speech in a town square, you'd be basically called the crazy person. The idea, the only way to actually get your voice across would be through social media. Now, this is where we get to sticky situations. Do we declare them private enterprise, or do we declare them part of a utility, and declare them the new digital public square? If we declare them the new digital public square, then the idea of banning cannot happen, and we need to then enforce this new idea of the original law of the freedom of speech, which means they cannot enforce any type of code for people of the United States, and thus banning cannot happen under any such thing unless they basically cause people to riot, and then there could be some type of temporary suspension. And then it says, or of the press. Well, that would be that goes on the same lines. Is technically when it means on the idea of press, people when they were referring to the press, they weren't just referring to the legacy media. They were saying from the smallest citizen journalist all the way up to the largest person with it. Well, to get your media out there, you need access to all these things with it. And since nowadays we need there's different forms such as blogs or video services. The only way to do this without it would be actually through one of these services, and that brings us back to square one: are these mediums the public new digital public squares supposed to be considered as neutral and viewed as a public utility? And I think we're getting closer to that point where we need to view it in that manner, because of there's so much out there going from citizen journalism that I think we need to get past this idea, because maybe at one point we were talking about this when it was littered with cat videos and just cat videos and other stuff like that. Maybe at one point, this is several years down the road ago, probably almost a decade ago, maybe we could have talked about it, saying these were free enterprises, not really part of the public square. But nowadays, there's so much of citizen journalism going on these things that you can't even touch it, because you can't even touch it or threaten these people. And when you do that, you're essentially leading to this violation of essentially these pseudo groups essentially working in conjunction with a lot of times government agencies, or a lot of times political groups that are essentially trying to get rid of their enemies. And these are a lot of times what you're dealing with when you're dealing with social media. And I hate to tell it, but that's the way it is. And it says the next one is the right of people to peacefully assemble. It doesn't necessarily give anybody's right to assemble, but to peacefully to assemble. That means if you're a violent group, if you're acting violently, you automatically lose that right with it, and you automatically lose the right to assemble. And what needs to actually happen is the assembly needs to, at that point when we're talking that the group is known to be violent, is they need to essentially say, no, your petition is denied because of these other instances, because of, like, let's say we go corporate groups, these groups have done this and this. And this doesn't include dog birding, where you're basically having the opposition jump on these groups to basically cause this. Like we've seen Antifa people try to do it with the people of the Trump supporters, because they want to make a bad name for them. That doesn't count. And that's what we need to understand. That doesn't count for that. What this refers to is people that are actually naturally violent. If you're a naturally violent group and you've caused a lot of natural amounts of violence, a lot of property damage, if you are leaving garbage around, like a lot of these so-called environmental groups that are doing their assemblies, are leaving a bunch of garbage around. That could essentially be viewed as not being peaceful to the area. And if you're doing a lot of interacting with people that's violent, you should be essentially be denied to assemble, because it does not say you have the right to assemble in general. It says peacefully to assemble, and it's very, very specific with those words. And then the last one is to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This means when the government makes mistakes, this essentially is the last line of defense before overthrow. This means when the government makes rapid mistakes, you're basically telling them, we're warning you, and you made constitutional violations. We want you to fix these. This includes like the FISA abuses, trying to overthrow elections of people, grievances on the such things like the Second Amendment, trying to infringe that, and so on and so forth. Violations of privacy, and trying to force people to do things against their own will. And when we see this, that's where the redress of the petition for the government for redress of grievances comes through. And when we and that's really usually a last ditch resort. And that's where the First Amendment comes in. And the first, and you'll see with what we go on with tomorrow, is the First Amendment is really meant to be backed up by the Second Amendment. That's why those who are intelligent understand the First Amendment is basically enforced by the Second Amendment. That basically, if you do not respect the First Amendment, the Second Amendment is there to basically enforce it. And the Second Amendment's not there for hunting, and it's not there for basic general protection of your house. It's there to guard against tyranny, and that's the sole reason. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it on social media. make sure you share it with your friends and share it publicly, please. Make sure everybody subscribes in that. And I'll see you later on for another what do you call it? Live stream. If this doesn't come loaded after the live stream, which I believe this is probably going to be after the live stream anyway. So, bye everyone.